when an eviction is filed, evictions have played a significant role in creating California's affordable housing crisis and our homelessness crisis. I know that you've heard statistics about this from the previous presenters, but before the pandemic, 8 out of 10 extremely low income households and over 5 out of 10 very low income renters were paying more than half their income in rent. Some say 90, some households paid 90% of their income towards rent. And communities of color disproportionately bear these crises, with Black, Latinx, and immigrant households significantly more rent burdened than white households. So even before COVID-19, people have been struggling to pay the rent and to stay housed in California. Now, the California Judicial Council, which is the body that regulates the court system in our state, adopted a temporary emergency rule on April 6th that effectively stops the courts from processing evictions during the state of emergency. There is related to COVID-19. There's a limited exception for cases in which courts make findings that there's a health and safety reason to proceed with the eviction, although those are rare. I want to note that the rule does not suspend the tenant obligation to pay rent. It is also temporary. The rule expires, by its own terms, the rule expires 3 months after the COVID-19 state of emergency ends. Hasn't ended yet in California, but the court officials have indicated that they could end it earlier than that. They could end it now if they wanted to. Meanwhile, as of April 1st, more than 80 California cities and counties have adopted tenant protections, including temporary bans on evictions. They're very unique to each city and county, and the details really vary. What's important to note is when that threshold of that, or that floor for all Californians is lifted by the Judicial Council, then tenants are going to have to kind of navigate these additional tenant protections, based on what city or county that they live in. And a lot of they're, for the most part, going to need to go to court to show that these individual the local protections apply to their particular circumstances. Now, despite the statewide moratorium and local tenant protections, we have heard reports of landlords still attempting to displace tenants from housing using a variety of methods, including calling the police, trying to trick tenants into leaving by serving them with papers that look like they've been issued by the court but haven't, or simply by changing the locks. I want to stress that all of these methods are illegal. And in the instance of calling the police on tenants, we're having a national conversation on the relationship between the police and communities of color, and particularly Black communities. So we can even, this behavior is actually dangerous in many instances. Now, landlord groups are also fighting, their associations are fighting eviction protections in court and have been attempting to challenge these rules. We're confident, though, that the emergency measures that the local governments and that the state court leaders have taken are necessary and reasonable in light of the pandemic. But we do need to think about what we need to do to help people stay in their homes when these temporary measures end and tenants have to pay rent owed. So for that reason, and just the fact that the massive unemployment rates and limited government aid, which the other presenters have covered in detail, when the rule is withdrawn and the moratorium lifts, we expect this massive eviction crisis. And if we allow the evictions to simply start again without any long-term assistance, it's going to have a devastating impact on renters and in particular communities of color, right? So for that reason, Western Center, we're co-sponsoring legislation, Assembly Bill 1436, which is called the COVID-19 Eviction Prevention and Housing Stability Act. At core, this legislation is designed to give tenants a fair chance to pay back rent owed, and preserve the ability of landlords to pursue unpaid rent through civil actions as opposed through the eviction process, which is currently the case for unpaid rent that is more than a year old. It also contains protections for renters from negative impacts to credit and therefore the ability to rent in the future. So this legislation is a chance for communities. AB 1436 is a chance for communities and individuals to tell their state legislators here in California to stop the looming wave of evictions to keep us all safe and housed. It is, I want to stress, the first step of many that we need to take to bring more equity into housing in California. But this is a great way for people to become engaged. And I also want to touch on, the fact that renters groups have been forming. Emily mentioned renters unions, tenant unions. These are important ways for people to basically important ways to create people power to advocate for tenants, which is again more important than ever. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, please ask your question.
Nisha, we have heard that despite this eviction moratorium, there has been some eviction or attempts to evict tenants during the pandemic. By any chance, do you have numbers about these evictions since California declared the state of emergency due to the COVID-19? And do you think that AB 1436 is going to pass? What are the challenges? Because we are very close to the end of the legislative year. And a last question is that is allowed to increase rental rents during these times?
Yeah, okay, great, thanks. So your first question with respect to numbers regarding attempts to evict, I don't have numbers right now. I mean, obviously the situation is very fluid and happening very quickly. However, we are hearing the anecdotal stories about how widespread this problem is from our legal services partners in the various cities and counties throughout Los Angeles. We know that this is not an insignificant problem. And the attempts to evict are both the kind of legal attempts to evict and, as I mentioned, the illegal attempts to evict, the changing the locks or trying to call the police or do some other kind of engage in some kind of forcible behavior to get tenants to vacate. Regarding 1436, I think at the California legislature, the legislators are well aware of the need to address this crisis head on. And for that reason, I think that's yes, there is very little time left in the legislative session, but I think that the legislators are looking very, very closely at 1436 and other proposals to be able to stave off this crisis or at least mitigate it. And then with respect to rents increasing, so it kind of depends on cities and counties. There are, and just kind of patchworks of protections. For example, Los Angeles City has passed a rent freeze for any rent stabilized or rent control housing. And so the rent freeze doesn't mean that the tenant isn't obligated to pay rent. A rent freeze means a rental increase freeze. So, again, it's very dependent on the tenant's individual circumstances. And for that reason, we urge people to contact their local legal aid or legal services programs in order to get information that's tailored to their specific circumstances.
Thank you. Henrietta and Frank, you both had questions for Dr. Kushel that I believe Nisha is equally able to answer. Henrietta, could you ask your question?
Yes, thanks so much, Sunita.
Of course.
Given the hardship that people are facing now and the economic difficulties, has there been an increase in illicit activities like drug dealing, prostitution, that people are turning to pay their expenses?
I haven't heard reports about that. I mean, what we do know is that people are becoming increasingly desperate in these times to be able to keep a roof over their heads or to keep themselves, and their families fed. And so that just underscores the importance for there to be meaningful financial and rental assistance, and from the federal government to the state government to local jurisdictions.
And Frank.
Yeah, so my question was for Margot. Do you have statistics for homeless rates within Indigenous and Native American communities? And do you see a rise in homelessness for Indigenous communities that maybe only speak an Indigenous language and are not fluent in English or Spanish?
I'm going to pass that question to Margot.
Margot, are you still on the call?
I am, yes. So we know that Indigenous Americans are overrepresented by a factor of about 8 in the homeless population. So compared to their presence in the population in the U.S., the numbers who are homeless are about 8-fold. I would say that for urban Indigenous populations, that winds up looking a lot like other homeless populations in urban areas. It's just at a dramatically elevated rate. In rural areas, it often is more hidden because it's not, it's sort of people living in garages or substandard, really, vehicles or other substandard places. And I think that our concerns are with the current pandemic, all of the initial already horrific disparities are just going to increase. I think there is less known about populations who, let's say, who might not speak, who speak other languages. I would be afraid that they would be less likely to be served or even captured in any formal statistic because they're kind of left out. But Indigenous Americans actually have the highest disparity in terms of disproportionate presentation in the homeless population, and it's about an 8-fold increase.
Thank you, Nisha, and thank you, Dr. Kushel, again. We're going to move on to Akash Kalia, who has a really incredible story about turning his father's motel into a shelter for the homeless population. Akash, welcome.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. So yeah, as Sunita mentioned, I had purchased my parents' old hotel in 2012, and I ran it as a hotel for a number of years. I was in my early 20s, working 12 to 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, and I was like, you know what? I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. What can I do that has a social impact, but being a small business owner can also maintain the business viability, as I have a mortgage to pay and a family to support. And so in 2015, I converted our 104-unit motel into permanent supportive housing for formerly homeless veterans and chronically homeless civilians. And we've been running ever since, and it's been incredibly successful, not only in our outcomes, but also on a financial basis for our local community, because in Sonoma County, where we're based, the average chronically homeless individual costs our continuum of care, our community, between $80,000 and $180,000 per person per year to do nothing. That's based on law enforcement interaction, inpatient hospitalization, uses of crisis services. And at the Palms, it costs our local community $13,000 per person per year to house them with all of the robust services that we have on site. And so we have a food distribution that comes weekly. We have a mobile health clinic that comes. We have, guitar sessions. We have 12 AA/NA meetings weekly. And it's really about all of these robust services. It's the only thing that maintains housing for this very vulnerable population. It's really easy to put somebody in housing. It's very difficult for them to be able to maintain their housing. And we've been really fortunate that we've had, thus far, we have a 96% success rate in people maintaining their housing. And so around kind of COVID and our current economic situation, specifically in the hospitality industry,